Hello everyone, I'm Janet Salmons, and I'm offering this presentation to complement the report. So I won't duplicate the information provided there, but hopefully to offer a few ideas that might spur further thought and discussion. So greetings from Boulder, Colorado, on the other side of the globe. And just as a brief introduction, I'm on the faculty of Capella University School of Business and Technology, where I spend my time supervising students at the dissertation stage. They are online students, and for the most part are studying online and social media related topics. I've also written several books for Sage Publications about online interview research. So the topics we're discussing here in this presentation are ones that I encounter on a day-to-day basis. So they're dear to my heart and inspire a lot of curiosity and interest, and I hope they're of interest to you as well. So just as a brief introduction, this report and related presentation emerged from the entire kind of bank of data that came out of all of the events conducted from the project over the last year, from the new social media, new social science events and blog posts, and responses to a little questionnaire conducted last year, which involved answers from people across the globe, so from a larger geographic area than these particular events, a lot of which were conducted in the UK. So out of those, I analyzed to find the themes related to ethics and the kinds of questions and concerns that folks in the network raised. Then I looked at the materials they suggested as the ones they consult when they're trying to determine how to make ethical decisions about their own research. So some were from government documents, some were from professional associations, business resources, and other books and articles. So for this report, I sifted through and selected those that were richest in material related to online and social media research. And so those are from the Association of Internet Researchers, from the British Educational Research Association, the British Psychological Society, Market Research Association, Market Research Organization, and then from SMR and CASRO. They're both business research entities and have their own documents intended not to guide scholars, but to guide market researchers. I excluded the government documents and regulations from this particular report just because they did not focus, on the kinds of areas kind of central to these questions. However, I provided some links to some of those materials in the report. So the question I was focused on is to what extent do these resources address the concerns and questions raised by members of the network? And what are the gaps and the unanswered questions, and how or should they be addressed? Those are questions I pose to you as you look through these ideas and questions and resources and think about the future of researchers in this field. So as I sifted through this information, I grouped the responses into 7 interrelated themes. And so as you'll see, these first 5 themes are ones that are of direct relevance to researchers today, people who are trying to design, conduct, write about their research. And then these final two themes are kind of larger themes that really are questions, for the entire field, to think through. So in terms of the questions related to participants, as I'm grouping them here, they fell into two main categories. One was, how do we recruit ethically in social media sites using social media communications? Uh, what kinds of issues do we need to keep in mind if we're trying to recruit participants in those ways? And then once we've found them, how do we verify that they are who they say they are and that they are, of the right age, and we've not uh, inadvertently selected people who are outside of our inclusion criteria, or perhaps would not be appropriate to the study. In looking through the guidelines on these issues, there was little, really specific to those questions. And, the couple of points I pulled out here from the CASRO materials really focus on transparency, of making sure that when recruiting online, we clearly represent what it is we're trying to do, and that we can make available through links or whatever relevant policy and terms and conditions and expectations for potential participants. So there are lots of outstanding questions for consideration, and that I hope you'll give some thought to in this area. So, when is it appropriate to recruit participants online? Are the people we're trying to study online? Do they use social media? So are we, really finding, even for a qualitative study where we're doing a purposive sample, are the right kinds of people actually using these social media tools? And so, are they suitable? What kinds of ethical pitfalls might arise? How should we address them? What kind of permissions, should we try to obtain from membership groups, say, discussion groups or lists? And then what time-efficient and cost-efficient ways can we use to verify participants' identities? So speaking of identities, this was another quite large kind of bucket of concerns raised by network members. So, there's kind of one category of issues about the identity of ourselves as researchers. When or should we disclose our identities as researchers if we are collecting data through observations or through materials we are drawing down or scraping from social media communications? And then when we do decide to disclose our identities, what's the best way to do that? How should we present ourselves in a way that will not cause a negative effect on the kind of behaviors and interactions occurring in that site? There were also questions raised, kind of about, how we, our identities online in general. And if someone, just as we're concerned about the credibility of the participants, they may be concerned about our credibility as researchers. So just as we can Google them to find out who they are and what they're up to, they can Google us too. So what is our kind of online identity more broadly, and how might that influence our work as researchers? And then, another giant question around the identity, who, we think in terms of research ethics about the protection of human subjects, but it might not be a clear-cut decision to identify, whether we have human subjects or not. So, there are kind of many very large topics to discuss, and real existential questions about, the identities that we have and how we represent them. And so, in looking at the guidelines from the associations that I mentioned, the Association of Internet Researchers, the British Psychological Society, and the British Educational Research Association, very interesting to find that, rather than really providing guidelines on these, actually, they raised, a number of additional questions. So, as we're looking at human participants and just thinking about, is the ways that people relate to one another and represent themselves online, often with pseudonyms, sometimes with avatars, other kinds of representations, even the choice of photographs and how we choose to kind of create our online identities. And so, which of those identities are the participant that we are interviewing, and how do we protect and acknowledge and even get consent from those various identities. There are points about, in terms of identifying when we have human participants that we need to protect in a conventional way that we think about with research ethics. And, one of the questions is, what is the distance between the person and the data, the person who originally made that post, and now this gigantic database of, lots and lots and lots of posts or tweets where, an individual, seems kind of far from removed from that data. But, are they really, to what extent do we need to keep in mind that somebody somewhere actually made that post, and what's our responsibility about them? And then again, about our representation online and how we develop not only to disclose our identity as researchers, but to develop relationships with participants. So, many, many issues involved here, and, lots and lots of questions. So here are just a few about creating an online presence that conveys credibility, thinking about disclosure and when it would be acceptable to lurk and do covert observation and data collection. What the ethical issues are around using large data sets or databases or large collections of data that we might pull down online. And then, in terms of identifying participants who might be involved as collaborators, to review some of our protocols is a suggestion that's been made in a number of the materials. And so, if that's a strategy we want to use, what is our ethical, kind of responsibility towards those participants who we might bring in as collaborators in the study. Another issue, another big kind of collection of issues around research site. So we might define a research site as the setting where the study is taking place, where we are interacting with participants or collecting data from participants. And so one of the points and kind of, whole sort of bucket of questions in the NSMNSS participants posts suggested that, because the communication features and the ways that people interact are so very different in every social media and social networking site, and as new ones emerge, there are yet, other ways that people communicate. That not only means that there are different types of data that might be collected, but, also, different kinds of ethical dilemmas that might be associated with them. So, questions around navigating all of that. And then, the recognition that each of these kinds of sites and communities has its own cultures and norms. And, how do we learn about those to know, if we want to, we're going with the best intentions of respecting them, but, how can we learn what those are and what is important to that group so that we are, kind of acting within, our best ethical behavior. And then, expectations about public versus private. And this was probably one of the, most debated items. And, when I coded all of these materials in NVivo to try to pull out the themes, the public versus private, kind of differentiation was, by far, the most prominent set of questions, and no easy answers around that. And I hope that you'll look at the report and some of the issues that were raised in the guidelines I reviewed. One of the kind of interesting sets of issues around the temporal dimension. So, how do communications and posts change over time? So, the fact that someone might have a communication they thought at the time was private, but then, as it is archived or whatever the convention of that site may be, may have started out as private, but then became public. This extends even to the communications between researchers and participants. So if we're using, say, a chat area within a social media site to conduct an interview with a consenting participant, with the thought that, this is a private communication, that, in fact, we don't, have the kind of authority to keep it private, and, may then become public, become searchable, and the whole situation has changed. So, many issues about, definition and, what we call things and how we describe different layers of privacy and public, natures of the sites. And then, lots of questions about the expectations and perspectives of users. And so the NatGen report that is also coming out, with a study about users' perspectives, highly relevant to complement this work and to further the discussion about, what users think about the posts that they make, and in the different kinds of research sites, and how they expect those to be used, or anticipate others understanding of what they've presented. So again, lots of questions to think about, but here are a few about how to, if we can't have a hard and fast differentiation between public and private with the changing and fluid environment, how do we differentiate them, in the context of the studies we're designing, and what kinds of criteria should we use for making that kind of decision, in the context of the research site and given the nature of the study. And then we've got the start with the study the NatSen researchers did about users' views, but as we're looking at a particular site and trying to determine what the expectations are of users in that site, how can we go about finding that out? And again, what kinds of permissions are needed? What site policies or user guidelines do we need to acknowledge as we are trying to decide, how we want to operate in that site? Informed consent then is kind of a logical flow. If we decide that it's private and we're doing the kind of study where we're interacting with individuals or collecting data, observing individuals, then we may need to think about informed consent. and again, many questions about what it is, whether the kinds of consent we've used in the past really fits online, when, during the study, before the study, after the study, should we obtain consent? How do we obtain the consent? Lots of things to think about in that area. One of the, again, when I looked at the guidelines, rather than providing suggestions about how to do this or when, they for the most part raised additional questions and other issues researchers need to consider. One of the most interesting ones from the British Psychological Society was around the difficulty of really accurately informing people online, because we know, I'm sure that you and I, as internet users, have not read, all of the permission policies and user policies and all of this different kinds of statements that are, pages and pages that are downloaded, and we just check, yes, I accept, and go on to do what we want to do. The fear that, this might be just the same thing that participants might do. So even though we've tried to provide informative information about the study and our expectations for participants and how the data will be used and all of that good stuff, that they may just check it off without reading it anyway. So those efforts may be in vain. It's just hard to know. Another question to look at. Again, about the timing and issues around the potential harm of either getting consent or of not getting consent. Where where are we best positioned in terms of, based on the nature of the study, the population, the setting, and other factors. So more questions for you to think about here. How can we make sure that the participants understand, if we're trying to inform them so they can consent, how can we make sure that they really understand what they need to know about the study and our expectations of them? Are there other kinds of approaches for obtaining consent and for even signifying consent in social networking sites like YouTube, Twitter, Facebook? Are there new ways we need to just think about consent generally? And, do we perhaps need to even rethink the kinds of points we ask participants to, agree to in the consent form, such as permission for using images, whether or not they agree to allowing us to use information that might be in their profile. Perhaps we even want to ask whether we have their consent to use information we find about them, on another site. So if we're doing a study in Facebook, can we use their tweets? Can we use their LinkedIn profile? Do we need to kind of extend and update the whole kind of format of the agreement to cover, a variety of these, kinds of, very precise but important decisions about, what information we can use and where, because, some of the guidelines pointed to the fact that people might be okay with the publication of a study using their user-generated material as data for, say, a dissertation or an academic publication, but would not want to see it published in a popular magazine. So, are there restrictions about publication? So, lots of things that we might want to consider including in, a modernized consent agreement. So, then we get to the data itself. And of course, these themes are all interrelated. And, we've talked about data throughout, all of these questions. But in particular, some of the issues around ownership, who owns the data. If someone is posting to Facebook or Twitter, or posting a YouTube video, or any other kinds of even post to a blog, um, a recording of a session like this, who owns it? Does the user who generated the content own it? Does the commercial company that owns all of these sites, do they own it? If we're collecting it as data for our study, can we say that we own it, because this is now part of the study we're conducting? Lots of questions around that. There were a number of questions raised by network members about kind of using data that is collected for one purpose for another purpose. So, if data has been collected, say, for example, the example given was health records that, have been collected for one purpose, can then a researcher come in and make use of those, for another purpose? What are the ethical issues around that? And as mentioned earlier, questions about the big data that what we call big data, those big collections of materials that have been assembled. What is our responsibility to the original person whose data is represented there? Can we even determine who they are? How would we find them to get their permission? How do we deal with that? Lots of questions around that, and suggestion, in the guidelines that it's not proper to ignore those questions. So we need to somehow think about how we're going to handle them. And then a number of questions were raised by network members about, particularly from qualitative researchers who are accustomed to drawing out quotes and excerpts of materials to provide depth and nuance to their descriptions of the data from the data analysis. And now in the age where we can kind of put a couple of things together and be able to search out and find someone, can they be truly anonymous, or how can we use the excerpts, in some way, and refashion them, in some way, to illustrate our findings without jeopardizing the confidentiality with the participants. So, once again, the temporal issues about, does the privacy of the data change over time? Does the nature of how it was collected, why it was collected, is that different as we now move forward and we think about into the future, whether the interactions we've recorded or other kind of reports from the data might be available, and suddenly kind of the identity of participants or other kinds of private information could become public. So you can see that public-private question keeps popping back up. Again, questions about publication, use of the data, ways of protecting the data that we've collected. The users' awareness about the materials that they've posted, and the potential for the materials they've posted to become our data as researchers, and a number of questions around the levels of awareness and the digital literacy of users. So, for example, if someone is sharing a lot of very personal information, might we assume that that person is not aware of the ways that other people might be able to access this, that their digital literacy is not sophisticated, and might we be taking advantage of that person, whereas a more savvy user would say, hey, I'm not going to post that kind of information online because I know that someone could find it and use it, and I don't want this getting out there. I'll have this conversation with someone in another way. So a lot of questions not only about users' expectation, but kind of our ethical responsibility towards people who might reveal information out of their own kind of ignorance of how the internet really works, and what might happen later on. So again, many questions raised about that. I think should seed some good conversations about how we can operate as researchers, and what the responsibilities we have are to the participants, or to the users, if we don't even consider them participants, to the original generators of the content that's become our data. So as I mentioned at the beginning, there were, in addition to all of those, which are very much nuts and bolts questions about research design, conduct, reporting, there were also a number of issues raised by the network members, and I must say these were passionately raised. People in the little questionnaire wrote in comments to bring up these questions, just very concerned about the lack of or inadequate guidance. Many comments about the inadequacy of existing text guidance, instruction about research, and in the context of these changing technologies and the many different ways we use technology, not only to collect data, but also to share with our fellow researchers, and to publish our materials. So, lots of comments from members about the need for new thinking about research and ethics, and the literacies for researchers. And this was the term that was used, literacies. So, what kinds of new literacies do we need as researchers today, and how will those be developed? So just even though I know you can't read the fine print over here, I wanted to share this just to show that, when asked, what ethical questions and issues about online social media related research deserve more attention and more clarity in terms of the guidelines, texts that are available, skills of those who not only supervise students, but even editors, people who are give research funding, just kind of across the board. You can see that there was no one dominant issue that emerged. There were kind of the pieces of the pie in this pie chart, pretty comparable in size. So, the comment that, whenever they were given the chance to answer all of the above, that's what they did. And the comment, I think they would all benefit from attention and clarity. So of the themes that I've mentioned here, trying to distill down, kind of collect into some bigger categories, these, items, all of them, certainly interrelated. And from the point of view of the comments made by network members throughout these events and questionnaire, a real desire for more clarity. This one, as I mentioned at the beginning, I supervise dissertation students, so I must say that I found this one, interesting, shall we say. So this and these charts are from the responses to the questionnaire. So when asked, how do you make decisions about research ethics? And they could check all that apply. So the one that got the most votes was this one: follow guidelines established by your field, discipline, or related profession. So those guidelines, such as the ones I've consulted for this report, are certainly attended to by those who are thinking about what ethical behavior would be most appropriate. But the second one, the close second, is go by your own values and instincts about what is good ethical practice. So I thought that, it was pretty interesting that that one got more votes than, say, follow guidelines by research methods books, or the lowly dissertation supervisor is way down here. So, this, I think, would be an interesting, I would love to be in a discussion with all of you about just the answer to this question from the network members. Do we think it's a good thing that people are going by their own instincts in terms of determining what is ethical or what is not? Or do we maybe say, maybe it's not such a good idea that everyone just individually invents their own interpretation of ethics for their research? And, what you think is ethical may not be what I think is ethical. So, how do we bridge that and make sure that, we are really, protecting human subjects? Just, I thought, you know, intriguing. And then some of the written comments that I drew from these materials, that researchers feel we're left to our own devices, get conflicting advice, which causes confusion. IRB ethics boards, which vary from school to school and country to country, but a number of comments, they seem to be afraid of the internet. The technology is moving so fast, by the time the guidance is in place, the technology is moved and the guidance is out of date. Lots of comments about, it's like I look at and hear the term guidance, is kind of covering the materials from research guidelines, guidelines from associations, professional societies, the guidelines from our institutions, kind of all of the above. Anywhere I'm getting guidance, it's just like by the time it's in there, it just doesn't cover, all of the things that I'm trying to deal with. Behind the times, not enough. So one of the points that I discussed in the report, and I hope will be food for thought for your own discussions, is that in looking at these sets of guidelines, and I want to applaud the people who put together these guidelines, and I was involved in a tangential way with the Association of Researchers of Internet Researchers guidelines, and for the others that I consulted here, I know that a lot of careful thought went into those, but they raise many more questions. So there is in reviewing them for this report and presentation, what struck me was that there is an implicit expectation that the person using these guidelines has the experience, the discernment, and understanding, to be able to then interpret them and apply them to their own research, or that they have a mentor, an editor, or a dissertation supervisor who could help them say, well, okay, given the nature of this study, which of these questions do I need to answer? how do I need to apply these to my study? So, what I gather from looking at these kinds of comments and in the context of the kinds of guidelines that, again, offer more questions than answers, is that folks out there are really, feeling confused, conflicted, looking for some more guidance than they're receiving from the sources they have access to. So, perhaps not surprisingly, there were many comments and recommendations from network members throughout not only the questionnaire, but other discussions and tweet chats suggesting that we need some kinds of training or materials or opportunities for exchange that would help to develop the skills of people who are in the roles of, whether it's dissertation supervisors and committees for students or funders, editors, peer reviewers for more experienced researchers, that somehow we need to kind of broaden the uh, the group with understanding of this kind of online research ethics beyond the early adapters and the enthusiasts who have taken the time to really think through these questions and make sense of them for their own research. So what you know moving beyond that, as more people, as this kind of research becomes more mainstream, how can we kind of bring more people in and provide some guidance that will help them to support the researchers who turn to them for advice or support. What kinds of materials do they need to help advance and really expand and further this field in the broadest sense. And then, if that were not a big enough picture, there were also a number of comments throughout the events about really the question raised by the new social media, new social science project as a whole, which ends in a question mark, saying, well, okay, do we need new social science? Apparently, from the point of view of these participants, yes, we do. And what I found interesting is the emphasis that was placed on multidisciplinary, interdisciplinary, cross-disciplinary solutions and ways of thinking, not only about research ethics, but also about methodologies and methods and the whole kind of ecosystem of research. So apparently this question, new social media, new social science question mark, is one that deserves further thought and exploration. So as we move forward, lots of questions to consider, and I hope that they will seed your thinking and further dialogue, not only at the events through the blog and the Twitter and future opportunities that we may have to think about how we can learn together and create the kind of environment where both new and experienced researchers can use social media and the online environment to create new knowledge, because isn't that what research is all about? So thanks for your attention. I hope that you have gained some food for thought, and I look forward to hearing more about what your ideas are for moving forward.